In this podcast, I'm going to talk about difficult feelings like grief, and I'm going to share some personal grief that I've been going through in my life. And I am going to offer you a helping hand if you're grieving that you've lost your child, that your child is disappearing in front of your eyes, your child's not speaking to you, your child's not making friends, and you're afraid, you're looking into the future and you're fearful. I'm gonna be here with you through those difficult feelings of regret and anger and frustration and maybe even bitterness. And I'm gonna show you a way to heal grief and turn what you learn through grief into something that can turn your child's symptoms around. So if you're feeling angry or sorrowful or exhausted or broken by autism, this podcast episode is for you. We all want to talk about things when it looks good, when we feel better, when the worst is over, when we can take a breather, when things look good. But sometimes we just don't get to that point, and sometimes it takes a long time to get to that point because we are grieving, because we are stressed out, because life is tough. And I'm recording this podcast episode in a pretty exhausting phase of my life, and I think it's very timely, and I don't want to be that person who only shows up when things are done and finished and healed. And I think it's important to talk about it honestly, especially with this topic for today's podcast, which is grief. And interestingly enough, all throughout June, I've been talking to moms on the phone and via Zoom and Telegram, moms who came to me with problems and seeking support. And I've spoken to heartbroken moms, grieving moms, broken moms, sobbing moms, crying moms, angry moms. And I thought I wanted to reach out and touch you and be there for you in this podcast episode. So I'm going to be sharing a personal grief story, something that's, wow, it's been breaking my heart. Let's just be honest, it has. I'll listen to the end because I'll be sharing that story at the end of this podcast. And I'll be taking you through a bumpy ride through grief and the lessons of grief and the difficult taboo feelings that autism moms and moms with sick children with ADHD go through. It's inevitable if you have a child that's struggling that you're going to be going through this. And there are 2 or 3 different ways of handling grief, embracing grief, dealing with grief. One of them is a healthy one, and there are a couple of very unhealthy ones, and it can end up destroying your life and make your child more sick. Actually, it can limit your chances of turning your child's symptoms around if you don't know how to embrace grief and have the courage to sit with it and to learn from it. So yeah, let's start. Let's talk. Let's do it. Let's be honest. Let's be honest. So in June, I've been talking to all these different moms who came to me on these free calls that I've been offering to talk to moms about what's going on in their life, what's broken, what's missing, what's standing in their way, what's preventing them from turning symptoms around, basically. And I've been talking to them about specific game plans that we can come up with to help their children. And if that's something you want to do, just simply send me an email at contact@barefootautismwarriors.com and write game plan in the subject line if you want to have one of those. These conversations are very deep. we've been crying. Sometimes I've been crying with moms for over an hour. And that's actually why I'm recording this podcast today. It's because of all the moms. It's because of Christy. It's because of Jen. It's because of Miriam. It's because of Stephanie. It's because of all these beautiful, it's because of Tutu. It's because of all these beautiful moms that I've spoken to this summer. I want to honor them, and I want you all to benefit from and learn from them. These moms are all working with me now, but I want to help you too. So it's taboo to talk about grief and autism. We're not allowed as moms to say that we're grieving the child we never had, or we're grieving autism. It's something we don't tell our partners, we don't tell family members, we don't tell friends. I've spoken to a lot of moms who don't see their friends anymore. So we're going to talk about some really difficult feelings here, some tough feelings. Spoken to moms who are in isolation. They're isolated because they don't go out and see friends anymore, because their children are screaming or eloping or in danger, and their life is one big emergency situation. All they can do is try to keep their children alive. And here's one imperfect moment where I have not plugged in my microphone. So you've had some bad audio, and we're going to fix that and then continue. So I've spoken to moms who no longer have friends, and they're longing for their friends. And they're also grieving that their children, because their children have no language, their children can't express what they want. They can't say mama. Imagine having a child that's disappearing in front of your eyes, a child that cannot speak to you, a child that cannot express what it wants and its feelings. A child that you can see is being rejected by the other children because they cannot talk, they cannot communicate, and they don't have social skills. That's a massive grief. And it's something we probably don't expect until we're faced with autism. To ever look at your child thinking, I lost the life that I had, I lost who I used to be, I lost the family that I thought we were going to create. I lost the idea and the vision of my child having friends and having friends over. I lost that whole childhood memory that other moms are making. I'm not making that. I'm not creating that. I can't experience that because my child's not able to bond with other children. And then the shame of it, and having nowhere to go and talk about these difficult feelings of disappointment, of sadness, of sometimes even regret. Why did I ever have a child? And is it my fault? So this massive shame, this guilt, and the isolation of not having anyone to tell and talk to these difficult feelings about. So when you have a child who's either developed fully normally and then regressed into autism, where the child's now running away from you or constantly in danger, or some of these children are aggressive, your child is now violent against you or laughing in your face instead of communicating with you, making squeaky, screaming noises instead of talking to you and his or her family. So instead of having a relationship, instead of having a family bond, instead of creating memories, you go into a state of fight and flight, constant emergency, constant fear, constant stress, constant noise, constant worry, and despair because you don't know what to do. And if this is you, I am aiming to bring you hope and solutions for how you can escape this on the other side of grief, because this episode is dedicated to grief, and we need grief to actually go to that place of knowledge where a turnaround is possible, where we can change the situation, but we cannot run away from the grief. The grief needs to do with us, needs to have its way with us. So why are we grieving as autism moms? We're grieving because our children are gone. The child we thought we were going to have is not the child that's there, whether it's regression or whether the child never developed eye contact or a language. That bond that forms when a child is looking at you and talking to you and bonding with you, that bond, it's natural. We know what it feels like even when we haven't experienced it. And I'm sorry for my dog snoring in the background. And we are grieving it when we don't get to experience it. So we grieve the loss of connection, the loss of bonding. We grieve our disappearing children, because similar to having a parent who develops Alzheimer's, I'm sorry, we have to talk about these things the way that it is. It's real. This is a reality. I have had a child who was severely autistic before he was turned around, before I used my method to turn his symptoms around. And it took 4 years. But when he was in what I call the dark phase of autism, he was not there. He was my child. I loved him. I had him inside me. I had given birth to him. And I'd held him in my arms. And from the moment I brought my second child home from hospital, when my then later diagnosed child with autism, when he saw this baby, he started regressing. And he started disappearing. And he started becoming more and more aggressive and violent and stressful and sensitive, and had all kinds of sensory issues. And he became more and more bizarre in his behavior, and more ritualistic, and more illogical. And it was so incredibly stressful. He stopped sleeping at night as well. And it was like, I imagine it's the same feeling as, because he developed normally in his infant years until he was around 3. And I imagine it's like having a mother that you've loved and cared for and bonded with and know so well. And all of a sudden she switches personality. She turns aggressive. She doesn't recognize you. She doesn't bond with you, because there are pathways in the brain. There are connections that aren't firing and wiring anymore. And a person that you love is disappearing in front of your eyes. The person is there, but the person isn't. There but not present. Physically there but not present with you. That's a massive grief. We're grieving because we're longing. We're longing for that life that so many other families have, where they go on vacation, they go on family outings, they go visit friends, which we can't do as autism moms in the dark phase of autism. And when I talk about the dark phase of autism, my approach to autism is that it is going through phases. And in the beginning, before we know how to interpret these symptoms, such as nonverbal autism, aggression, rigidity, eloping, picky eating, sleeplessness, OCD, ADHD, lack of social skills and lack of cognitive skills and behavioral issues. In the beginning, when we don't know how to interpret them and adjust lifestyle, nutrition, and our approach to our children in a way that actually turns these symptoms around, also biochemical approaches, then it is like living with someone who's not there. It's like living with a person with Alzheimer's. So we're longing for that life that we either used to have when the child was developing normally or neurotypically, or we are longing for the life that we thought we were going to have before we got pregnant and before we realized that our children had these issues. So just like I think in a dysfunctional relationship where you are longing for that relationship with that person, that vision that you had, and because it's not happening, you're not met, you're not seen, you're not bonding, you're not loved that same way that you wanted to and expected, you still want to hold on to that dream. You want to hold on to that person. You want to hold on to that illusion. And what I'm going to share with you in this podcast about grief is that is not the way you are healing it. It's not the way that you're turning your child's symptoms around. It's not the way that you are overcoming grief either. To try and hold on to what we thought we were going to have, hold on to what we used to have, and grieving the fact that we don't have it long term. So yes, we need to go through a phase of grief, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But it's important that that grief doesn't take over, and that grief doesn't become our whole existence, and that grief does what it needs to do, and then we let go of it. And I will share with you how, and I also want to share with you how that's linked to turning autism symptoms around. Because there are several phases that we go through when it comes to grief. And I want you to know them and notice them so that you can recognize them in your own life. So we're also grieving that our children are hitting us. We're grieving that they're not sleeping at night. We're grieving that they're unhealthy. We're grieving that they don't want to eat healthy foods and therefore they're not developing cognitive skills and they are unhealthy. We're grieving that unconditional love that we feel in our heart is not reciprocal, because we feel that we're sometimes not receiving that from our child with symptoms because the child is in a state of emergency. And sometimes we forget that their brain is inflamed, their immune system is messed up, their gut is imbalanced, their neurotransmitters are not activated or working the way that they should be. So mood swings is inevitable. Their methylation is whacked so that their neurotransmitters and enzyme production and hormone production and activation is just not working. So these children are ill, but that doesn't mean that we cannot grieve that we are not receiving that unconditional love and that respect and that fun and that banter and that connection that other parents are experiencing. So we can grieve the loss of friendships, the loss of a social life, the loss of the ability to work, the loss of our sleep, the loss of our own health, because many of us inevitably will get very ill and unhealthy because of the lack of sleep and the massive stress that we are under and the pressure that we are under. It is equivalent to being in a war zone 24/7 for years. So what is grief and why is it important? I feel that grief is marking, it is reminding us that something is gone. And it is an important phase of life. It is an important lesson that we need to learn. That grief is here to tell us, hey, something is gone forever. Something will never come back. We experience that when our parents die. We experience that when we move into adulthood. We experience that when our children grow up. We experience that when someone's ill. We lose who we used to be. We lose something that used to be. And it's beautiful too. It's a death. It's an ending. And who we thought we were gonna be and who we used to be is no more. And so when that happens, it's actually really important that we allow time and feelings to heal that space between who we used to be and who we are becoming. So it's no use trying to escape the grief and the pain. And it's also no use. It's really not beneficial to stay in that phase of grief for too long. So you need to find the balance. And allowing yourself to feel grief about autism is really crucial. Don't feel ashamed about the grief. Don't feel like you shouldn't be grieving, because you should be grateful. And this child is perfect the way that it is. And if you're not grateful and if you're grieving, then you must not love your child. That is BS. So give yourself time to allow those feelings of pain and grief. And it's a form of acceptance, and there are different types of ways to deal with grief, and I'm going to talk to you about them now so that you can recognize the destructive ones and so that you can choose the healing versions of dealing with grief. You can deal with grief from a point of acceptance that will facilitate growth in you. So you accept that you're feeling grief, you accept that you're in pain, and you're allowing that pain to shape you. You are actually accepting that something is dead and gone forever, something is changed forever, and you are allowing the grief to roll through you like a wave, to take over your body. You are allowing grief to create sorrow and tears and sobbing and shouting and processing through your body like a virus that then activates your immune system and makes you stronger so that you can recognize danger and you can deal with difficult situations later on in life. That's the healthy way of dealing with grief. A really unhealthy way of dealing with grief is accepting and sitting in it and sitting on it and bathing in it and rolling around in it forever. Sometimes it's camouflaged as acceptance, but you'll find moms all over the internet who are in so-called acceptance, but always talk about how hard it is, how misunderstood they feel, how unaccepted they feel, how difficult life is for their child. And so it tends to become a negative spiral, camouflaged as acceptance because I'm accepting my child the way that it is. And it easily turns into pride, which is one of the most destructive feelings. And that's why it's one of the sins according to God is pride. It's because we then identify with the pain and we identify with the diagnosis and we identify with the symptoms and we turn it into our project. That's very dangerous playing field because it becomes a reinforcing. It reinforces the pain and it reinforces the symptoms and it creates more grief. And it can become addictive as well. Pain can become addictive because the stimulating cortisol and adrenaline and the stimulating feelings that are actually pain and grief, they are stimulating. They are highly stimulating feelings. We can get accustomed to them and we can get addicted to them because the brain will always maintain status quo. So the healthy way of dealing with grief is to accept and grow and let it rip through our veins and let it destroy who we used to be and kill who we used to be in a battlefield of death, so that from that ground, from that dirt, we can sprout a new reality, a new way of parenting. And actually, that is what leads to turning symptoms around, because we need to understand it's not going to be the way that it used to be. It's going to be something completely different. And in many cases, when moms understand how big of a part her own healing is and plays in the child's turnaround, it's a better place to be than the place we would have been in had it never happened to us, autism, or had we just accepted autism as it was. There's a third destructive way of dealing with grief that I quickly want to mention before I'm going to dive into the 6 phases of grief that you gotta understand in order to overcome it, and then I'll share my personal story with grief that I went through recently. So the third dysfunctional way of dealing with grief is to try and escape it. So not only we're not accepting it and we are not growing from it, we're trying to escape that grief, the pain, the bitterness, the disappointment, the resentment, the longing, the sobbing, the sadness. So we do that by eating or by scrolling or by numbing out that pain. Sugar is really effective when it comes to numbing out pain. That's why they give it to infants when they are teething, or they did that in the old days anyway. But we can do many things to numb out our feelings. We can step into pride, into vanity, into over-exercising, hyper-focus on diet, or intellectualism, something I've talked about in other podcasts, scrolling on Instagram, social media, getting addicted to other people's acknowledgement. Escaping can also be being in pride and acceptance, by the way. That's also an unhealthy way of escaping what transformation and death and rebirth that autism is actually here to teach us and expects of us. This is God's assignment for us. So we're trained to seek the opposite of the dark valleys and understand that escaping from it is not going to change your child's life and is going to probably create a bad future for you and your child. Healing through grief is movement. It is moving from who you used to be to who you are becoming. And you are turning it into resilience. And so these dark valleys of grief and symptoms and screaming and sleepless nights and not being able to do the same things as other couples and families do, that's actually a good thing, by the way. Do you realize how much distraction and how much time is wasted on the things that people do in this world when they go to restaurants and when they eat the same foods as everybody else and they go to entertainment channels for entertainment of their children. They talk small talk and days just go by in that hamster wheel. So it's actually, this is what autism wants. It wants to shake us. It wants to stir things up, and it wants us to stop doing what everyone else is doing. So it's actually a good thing that you're not fitting in. It's a good thing that you're not someone who can just plug into that whole social experiment anyway. But these dark movements of grief and autism symptoms, the dark valleys, we need them in order to build character, build faith in God and His plans for us with autism. That gift of autism, what He wants us to change, what He wants us to do, who He wants us to become. This movement builds resources in you. It builds skills in you, and it creates resilience like nothing else. And so when you go through the phases of grief, you start with immense grief and pain. So grief is number one, pain, extreme pain is number two. It feels so painful that you can't even really stay present in your body. That's how painful it is. That pain then gradually weans off and turns into lessons. you understand that autism happened for certain reasons. Not quite why and what reasons, but you get a glimpse of the lessons that are implemented in these symptoms. And then number 4, it turns into growth. So the dark valleys builds your muscle, builds your resilience, builds your faith, and it's a growth phase that you're going through. And then number 5 is that you understand that it's testing your faith in God, your faith in recovery, your faith in turning this around, your faith in you being chosen for this job. It's a sacred assignment. And then finally, step 6 is that everything falls into place and you find the purpose of autism in your life. What is it that this child is here to teach you, and what is it that you need to change? So I really hope that made sense. If you want support, if you want to talk to me or one of the elders, one of the more experienced moms in my community, send me an email, contact@barefootautismwarriors.com, or reply to the email you probably received if you are receiving updates on my podcasts and blogs, and just say game plan in the subject line, and we'll talk about what's going on in your life. So for me, I just wanted to share a personal grief that I've had recently. When we came back to Denmark recently after 7 years in the UK, I looked around and we moved back to my children's childhood area. And when we left, I had 2 children. I had a teenager and a child. And I was a mother of children. As we're talking about this, I can feel the grief, And we went into this, we went to England. I went into this false twin flame relationship that I'm very grateful for, because I wouldn't have come to God. I wouldn't have left New Age spirituality without that lesson. But in the UK, I realized how everything was fake. It took me many years to understand that I wasn't crazy, but that something was really dysfunctional in my life and in my relationship there. But I stayed for almost 7 years in that dysfunctional relationship with my children. And we lost 7 years of friendships, 7 years of growing up with family members around. I will say it saved my youngest child to be pulled away from the Danish drinking and smoking culture, because both of my children are now not drinking, not smoking, and they are going to bed early, and they are taking care of their bodies, which wouldn't have happened in Denmark because it's such a bad place to grow up as a teenager. We have world record in drinking and smoking, and that's a different story. But we missed out on 7 years of being in my children's childhood area by the ocean and the forest and my friends and my family. And when we came home, I looked around and I looked at myself, and the parents of the children from the soccer team and the school, they were now old people. And I looked at myself and I see an old woman. No, I don't see an old woman, but I see a gray-haired woman in her 50s. I no longer have children. I have adults. My kids are adults now. And so we missed out on so many things. And I have been grieving this. Been grieving the loss of Hornbæk, been grieving the loss of my house that I sold for this man, and the businesses that I closed for this man, and my children's childhood that's gone forever. And as I move through this grief and this pain, I know that the lesson is that I needed to let go of all of this to become who I am now. I needed all this hardship. I developed cancer there. And I would not have been able to support other moms through breast cancer in a natural way without that lesson. And I needed to understand what love is not in order to understand what love is, aka finding God and walking away from a New Age spirituality. And it developed my faith in God, and I found a unique purpose in that scenario. I would still have been lost in the New Age. I would still have been lost in extreme vanity. I can see, when I look at myself now, I can see that I'm not the beauty that I was when I left. And there's a tiny pang of grief when I look at those pictures of me before I was destroyed by this dysfunctional relationship and these years. But the purpose of stepping away from vanity and unconditional love, which is only received by God, the purpose of being able to help other autism moms through grief, through cancer, and through autism symptoms. Like, I have developed the quality of an elder now. I am an elder. I'm now officially a gray-haired elder in the autism mom community, and I can now train younger moms to be the next generation of moms who are going to help moms all over the world. I don't think that without this experience, I would have been able to reach moms in the US, in all over Africa, all over Europe, UK, Australia, and be relatable. Because before I left, I wasn't broken the way that I have been broken the past 6 years. And probably particularly the past year when I had cancer and when we moved back from England and had to start from scratch with everything from where we lived to financially to, and none of the friends left from when I moved, because I left the New Age spirituality and because I came to God. So grief is a lesson, just like autism. Grief is a teacher, just like autism is. And I'm incredibly grateful for the grief, the pain, the lessons, the growth, the faith, and the purpose that it's taught me. So my question for you as you're listening to this now is, what is grief teaching you about pain, and what lessons do you see? How can you grow from this? How can you develop your faith that there's a meaning behind this, that God wants something from you and for you through this? And what's the purpose of it all? Those are questions that are really important to ask ourselves when we're grieving. And I see every single day, and that's the gift that I have received through this hardship. I see moms turned around every single month and sometimes every day in the community. And that's the purpose of the pain that I've been through. There's no doubt in my mind. And bringing other women away from false spirituality and to that unconditional love and the purpose that God has given you through these hardships. That's another purpose that's been given to me through hardship. So I'm forever grateful for my grief and hardship and pain, and I will encourage you to share when it's difficult as well. And also share with me. Please send me an email if you're in grief right now, if you're in pain right now, and let's connect and talk about this. If you want to support me, if it's valuable to you, if it brings you anything, and if it's of value to you to listen to this podcast, I would so appreciate if you would rate this podcast in iTunes or wherever you're listening to it. Give it 5 stars if you feel like that's what it deserves. It means a lot for me to reach more people and to help more people, to rescue more children out of those symptoms that everyone tells you there's nothing you can do about. And the whole narrative around autism is crazy. We have an autism epidemic that we can turn around. And your reaction to this podcast episode can actually change other women's lives if you share it, if you rate it, if you give it stars, if you give it a rating, and if you talk about what it meant to you, even give me some words about why you like the podcast. I would love a follow on Instagram, NINKA-BERNADETTE MAURITSON. I would love you to go and check out the website, scroll around, check out the free resources at barefootautismwarriors.com, and maybe join the Facebook group Barefoot Autism Warriors. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being in my life. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I really would love for you to go and check out barefootautismwarriors.com, free resources, and sign up for one of the free guides for picky eating, or the 5 messages behind autism symptoms. If you haven't watched that mini series yet, go and look at that immediately. Check that out. And send me an email, contact@barefootautismwarriors.com, if you want to talk to me, and if you want to work with me through these difficult feelings, and if you want to understand how I turned my son's stimming and sleepless nights and rigidity and aggression and mood swings and nonverbal autism and sensory issues around, I can talk to you about what might be possible for you. Send me an email, write game plan in the subject line, contact@barefootautismwarriors.com. See you soon.